Well, hello friends, we are out in the garden. It's a gorgeous day. The sun is shining, the wind is blowing. You may hear the wind today. In Iowa, it is really kind of a prairie open area where I live, and that means the wind sometimes just blows through night and day for days on end, but you still have to get stuff done. So today is all about some containers, not annual flowering containers, but instead some containers I put around outside on my fire pit area. I call it a gravel patio, but it's really just an area in the middle of my backyard that I like to set some items that you cannot grow outdoors year-round in Iowa. We're talking my fig trees go out here, my rosemary plants, and then I also do a couple things with some mint to make sure I contain it, in the sense that mint is one of those things that it spreads all over the yard, it goes everywhere. So I have a way to make sure it doesn't do that, and that's using containers, honestly. So what I thought we'd do today is plant up some of those things, kind of get them ready for the summer, for the growing season. We're getting now into the nice warm days with warm nights where I can start really bringing out so many plants. The only ones I haven't brought out yet are my citrus, but this is the same place they go also. So I thought I'm gonna take you through that, show you what I do, because, you know, I've always learned, I learn best from seeing, from experiencing and watching. And that's what I think gardening is all about, seeing how other people do it, picking up little things that may help in your own garden, your own microclimate, whatever you have. So let's get started. So today we're gonna start with some mint. Now back here, this is the area I'm talking about. It is a beautiful little fire pit area, I call it. I kind of made it formal, and I put this in about 10 years ago. So the boxwood hedging has really started to fill in. It's really started looking nice, and I've just began bringing out some of the containers. You can see this rosemary topiary I've had for a few years. It's doing really well. My fig trees I brought out, and they're starting to leaf out. Now these are not Chicago hardy figs. These are brown turkey figs. They're Corky's Delight figs. They're ones that you cannot grow in Iowa, but I love them, and I get beautiful harvest, 1 or 2 harvests a year from 2 of these trees, which is really fun. So I've brought them out. I brought some of my bay plants. We're gonna pot up a couple new ones today, but mint is the first big one I wanna talk about, because I don't like mint taking over the whole garden. If you have a good spot for mint and wanna put it in the ground, go ahead. It's like a ground cover, it takes over, it will give you so much, and that's wonderful. It has its time and its place. What I find is it does best for me in containers where I can keep track of it and know what it's doing. Now, my last mint plant in this large container, I had in here for 5 years, and it stayed outside over the winter. You're probably thinking, wait, outside? I thought you said, like it's in a container. So containers are one of those tricky areas where certain things can live over the winter in a container. It just depends where it's at in your yard, what your zone is. You know, even small shrubs and trees can live in containers year round. Now, mint is one of the hardiest plants. It's actually really hard to kill, so it does really well in a container. What I do with these large terracotta containers is, yes, terracotta can crack over the winter. I don't worry about it. These I've had for a long time. What I do is, in the fall, I flip this container upside down, let the mint go dormant. In the spring, I usually flip it back, the mint fleshes back out. The only problem was it was becoming so root bound, so overtaken, and I kind of forgot to flip it over this spring, and it just needed to be replaced. So I bought a couple. You usually could just take a start of your own mint and do this. I'm buying a couple new starts just to have a fresh, clean slate for this. So we're gonna start by putting the soil in there. I'm using, of course, my favorite all-purpose organic potting soil. We're gonna make sure we amend the soil slightly. Anything, especially, vegetable, herb-based, that I grow in a container, I wanna make sure that I amend the soil to make sure it has extra nutrients, so it's not gonna be gaining them from the ground. And this works for any container type gardening, whether it's tomato plants, pepper plants, herbs, any type of container you wanna do, it is the same principle that I'm gonna show you. So to start off, the big thing is drainage. All these containers have really nice drainage. You can see the gravel through them on the other side. I always just put a shard of a piece of broken pottery. And remember how much I love the pottery. I think this broke either in a windstorm or my cats broke it, but either way. And I put it down over the pot, but you notice there's a curve in it. That allows water to still come and escape easily through the bottom, but it allows the soil not to just push through the bottom all the time. So I always want to cover the bottom hole, and it goes for little containers too. I do the same thing. You can also use, like a nice fine hardware mesh if you want to. Anything that's going to keep the soil in the container but allow good drainage. Any outdoor pot that is in full sun, full elements of rain coming down. I want to make sure it can drain because it can get inundated with water. And if a pot holds on to water, it usually can, starts root rot and starts plants not doing well. So Anytime you want to start some type of container garden, vegetables, herbs, start with a nice container, a sturdy big one that's not going to blow around, and make sure it has good drainage. You want it to have good drainage, and you want these roots to have space to grow. Mint is a pretty vigorous and quick grower, so you can see this is a big container and it's going to fill it in no time. I always am going to start with a good potting soil, and especially when we're growing food, but anytime I always go first for a good organic potting soil, because, you know, if we're going to be eating this, if we're going to be putting it into our bodies, we want to put the best foot forward, and that's starting with good soil. So I always just use all-purpose potting soil and fill up my container. And again, if this container had some leftover soil from last year, I would have just amended it slightly with a little bit of new soil, but it was so root bound, that mint that was in here, that I just need to add all new soil and start really with a blank slate. On big containers like this, I will sometimes add about half the container full of just an all-purpose, all-natural hardwood bark mulch. That's a nice way to do less than the cost. So it cuts the soil you need usually in half, and mulch is really cheap compared to soil, but it also still allows good drainage. That composts down over time, which is really nice. So you can really have a nice way to kind of offset your costs that way if you have big containers. But for this, I have enough soil here, so I'm just gonna make sure to put plenty of it in. And I really want to fill it up because the fresh potting soil works down over time. It's nice and aerated, which is good, but you just want to make sure you put plenty in so it doesn't just go down to nothing either. And now once I have that soil in here, the next things I'm going to do is make sure I amend it just slightly. So the first thing I'm going to do is do what I do to my vegetable beds or anything, and it's add some garden tone. I love garden tone because it's just a great all-purpose way to add some great food in an organic way to your garden beds or to containers that's going to grow food. So if I was going to put tomatoes in this container, I'd add some garden tone. If I was going to put any type of vegetable, peppers, any herb, garden tone. I'm just going to make sure I put a little bit in up here. And again, I'm just working it in the top few inches of the soil. We don't need to put it deep down in the soil. Those roots aren't going to be getting there for a while. So you just want to make sure you put it in right at the top, and that's all we need to do. So once I get that done and move that aside, I now have just this nice potting soil that I can just start and plant in. Now, every time I plant, even if it's a vegetable, I like to put in a little bit of biotone with it. It's just a starter fertilizer for the roots. Now, I could have gotten by with just putting one plant in the center. I want to make sure I get some mint here, you know, soon enough. So I'm putting 2 of these smaller plants per container, but really mint is one that it's going to take over. Now, if you wanted to, this is a large enough container. You could fill this up with 4 to 5 different types of herbs and let them just billow over. Mint for me is such a vigorous grower that I like to put it alone in a container and just let it take over, and it will last for years. Like I said, it's a perennial. Not all herbs are, but certain ones are. So I put a little bit of that biotone down in that hole with the roots. I just break them up slightly like I would any root. You can see how easy that is. And then I just take a little bit more biotone for the second plant, and I put it right in the hole I'm gonna plant it in. Just mix it right in. You don't need to do too much work to it. You just put it in, push it around. You can put your plant right in there, tamp that ground back around it, and then we'll water it when I'm all done here. But now, no joke, in a few weeks, I'll show you in my stories that I do. This will take over in no time, and it's such a nice way to not worry about it taking over the whole garden, which, you know, over at my mom's just across the road, we have garden in a corner by an old building that doesn't matter, and it takes over and it's great. I just don't have a spot like that here that I want it to do that. So I'm just gonna let this happen and we'll move on. So this is all about how I have containers that are technically perennial for me in the sense that mint, I don't even have to take indoors. It lives outside and it lives in this container and it's happy. But then I also want to plant containers that I can also keep for years by bringing indoors, and that's what rosemary does for me. So this is a smaller container because I'm starting with a pretty small rosemary. And while mint is going to take over quickly and it's okay being in a larger container like this, a lot of plants, even like rosemary, they don't need to be in a massive container like this size if they're such a small start. You can buy big starts that are expensive, but these small ones, this was $6, I think. It's gonna grow over time, and for years I'm gonna be able to keep this. Now, rosemary is one of the things I keep for years and years by taking it indoors to a above freezing, but it doesn't need to be heated, room. So it can be a garage as long as it's insulated, just a space that it doesn't get below 32 degrees Fahrenheit for me. Then it can just survive really easily. It definitely needs to be watered over the winter, but I find rosemary super easy to keep year to year. I just have to watch for things like mites on it. That's one of my biggest issues. So again, I'm starting with just the all-purpose potting soil, and you're gonna see my shadow here as I'm going, but I'm of course gonna put some of this garden tone with it again. It's just, I find, it's one of those things where for years I didn't do things like this. I didn't amend soils, I didn't add fertilizers. And the thing is, once you start doing it, you start realizing it really makes a difference. And so for me, every time I do little things like this, I know I'm having years of good growth and support. And then year to year, when I bring this container out, I will amend it with some more garden tone or compost as I need. And that way that soil just continues to be replenished. So now I'm adding just this beautiful rosemary, which it's a nice small start, but it's amazing how quickly, look at those beautiful roots on it, which I just lightly move. It's not root bound, so I just lightly put them in and I'm able just to push it right in there. And again, if you want to, you can have, a slightly bigger container than this, and you could put 3 different herbs together. And for one season, they would probably be fine. But since I want to keep this year after year, it's gonna fill this container and its roots will fill the container. So I don't wanna plant other things with it. So I'm gonna move on now that I have this planted, and we're gonna plant a couple new bay plants, and I'm gonna tell you why with these new plants. So I'm someone that wants to be able to grow so many things that I can't grow year round, but I also like the aesthetics of when something can look really pretty. So for me, bay plants are one of those things. Bay in general to me is misunderstood in the kitchen. We have those old bay leaves in our spice cabinet that are usually in a jar. They look brown, dry. They've been there maybe for years. You throw one in a soup or something and think, I don't know if it does anything, but you throw it in. The difference and the change comes when you grow real or fresh bay. And that's what I usually do. And I usually have these shrub varieties that are a little bit smaller. You can see this isn't huge here. But what it does is it allows me to year round, I take this in just like I do my rosemary. I put it in my plant room and it just sits there. It can stay pretty cool all winter too. And it allows me to have fresh bay year round. You can buy fresh bay leaves now in most spice sections or like the fresh produce section of a grocery store with the herbs, but they're expensive. This thing, you buy it once and for years you have these fresh bay leaves you can go out and get. And believe me, using fresh bay leaves will change your mind on bay in recipes. I'll throw this in sauces, in soups. It has such a much more forward flavor that you don't realize. I really do think it's a big difference. So what I'm though planting today are a couple bay trees. Now these are small, they're ornamental as you can see. So a couple years ago, I was at this shop, a fun shop, out when I was visiting my sister in Virginia. And the proprietor, the owner of the shop, had the most beautiful bay tree. And she said it was 20 plus years old. It was in a container that she brings in during the winter, sets outside in the summer. And it was gorgeous. And I could not get it out of my mind. So I finally found these small little topiary type ones that you can use the bay on still, that I'm gonna plant up. So I, in years, hopefully 20 years maybe, will have these gorgeous sized and just beautiful topiary bay trees. I feel like when you're a gardener, there's these little things that just excite you. This is one of those things for me. And so they're not always easy to find, but my local garden center got these in and I jumped on them right away. I had to get 2. So I thought we're gonna plant them up, and then all these containers I'm doing today are not just a one and done thing. So many annual flowers we plant, you enjoy them maybe for the summer and then you have to throw them out. Well, things like this you can keep year to year, and you can use them in the kitchen, you can use them around your house, whatever you want. They're ornamental, they look beautiful outside, but they're also usable. That's what I love. So to do this, I'm gonna do pretty much the same process, and I'll show you. So I'm on the back of my gator now, right by the area where I'm gonna set it. And I did the same thing. We have all-purpose soil, we have garden tone, we have biotone to help get those roots going. Now, the biggest difference I wanna look at with these is their roots. Now, sometimes in containers, roots can be really root bound, where they're really tight. With these, I'm just going in and checking, and just with my hand, I can move them apart, I can just open them up, and that's perfect. I don't need to do more than that. If they were really encircling and tight and starting to strangle themselves, I would cut through them, I would open them up to really start pushing them to want to grow outwards and laterally. This is going to be just fine as it is, but I do need to make sure it's going to be at the right depth. Obviously right now, it's way too high. So since this is already growing into a topiary type tree, I want to make sure to keep this root flare and this level it's at no deeper. I don't want to plant this down below because that can actually really hurt a plant over time. So I want to make sure I have enough room in here that I can push that soil aside and make sure we can put this down at the level it needs to be. And again, remember that potting soil is going to adjust and it is going to settle slightly with time. So that's always something to account for when you're planting something that's going to be in here for a few years. So you can see I got it sitting down correctly, level with that soil, no deeper than it was. I'm gonna keep the bamboo on it for a while. I will remove these green pieces of tape. These are great while they're forming this topiary, but over time as that trunk grows, these are gonna tighten too much and they'll start strangling and cutting into it. So I will just put some nice like eco-friendly twist ties, or even sometimes I use nylon hose just because it doesn't damage and it allows stretch. And I will tie it up to that bamboo with something else other than these. These to me are temporary. When you bring a tree or anything home from a nursery with these, they're temporary. Remove these and do something much more safe for over time. But I'm gonna do the second one and then we'll be good to go. So we're finishing these up, of course, just by watering them. And again, anything you put in containers, because containers are a great way to grow vegetables and herbs if you don't have in-ground gardens. But you have to remember, watering is key. They're in containers. They're gonna dry out quicker. The wind, the elements will dry these out much quicker. And you can see right here, as I watered it for the first time, do you see how it started taking some of that soil, that potting soil, and just dragging it down in, condensing it? This is when you will need to go in and top them off with more soil. Anything you plant with fresh potting soil is going to just draw down a little bit and condense once you water it. That's natural, that's what's gonna happen. So you just need to be prepared and make sure you top it off once you've watered it, because now it's exposing all these roots, and when those dry out, you know, even quicker because they aren't covered, of course that will stress the plant. So after I water everything really well, I'm just gonna obviously now be checking it daily, weekly, whatever you need, depending where you live, to make sure it's getting the adequate water that you need. Now, of course, if you have yours hooked up to drip line, that's really good and you won't have to worry about it as much, but still need to check it. This was obviously all about plants that I'm going to be bringing in and keeping year to year. But now I want to go plant a few herbs in my garden, my raised beds, that are perennial also, but outside perennial, where I don't have to do anything to them year to year other than just cut back their dead foliage in the spring. So it's kind of a great mix of things that you can grow in containers if you need to, or if you just want to bring them in the winter like I do, and things you can grow in the ground that will come back year to year, like herbs. So now I'm out in my vegetable gardens, which I use raised beds, as you can see. And this is kind of showing the difference between things I plant in containers versus in my raised beds, which honestly isn't that different. That's the beauty of it. When you watch someone garden, whether it's in a raised bed, whether it's in ground, there's not too much difference between that and container gardening, other than possibly the soils you used, the watering frequency, and things like that. But what now I'm gonna do is put in some both perennial and annual herbs, kind of talk about the differences, because some herbs can actually live year to year. I'm in zone 5B, so I have kind of a mix of ones that can live year to year and ones that don't usually, but planting them is really the same. I just have a small area of herbs because some of them I put in containers up where I just showed you, but my garden gets filled with my hot peppers, my tomatoes, my cabbage, broccoli, cauliflower, my greens, my radishes, all those things. And then over here we have my garlic and rhubarb, of course, and then asparagus, which I need to go pick. And then we have perennial onions right here, and shallots, the Dutch red shallots, which won't be ready here for a while. But right here in this little area are some herbs. Now, some of them, this is the second year for them. So French tarragon, this is, well, actually the second or third year. It dies back as a perennial. I remove the foliage early spring, and then out comes all this beautiful, beautiful fresh herbs to use. I've actually already started using it. I love tarragon with peas is one of my favorite, but with asparagus, it's great. It's great to make kind of your own buttermilk dressing with, a ranch style dressing, any of those things. It's so good. I also had an oregano that did really well over the winter and is coming back. What I do need to replant is my English thyme. It's a hit or miss for me. English thyme really should be perennial. I just sometimes, depending on the winter, will have years where it isn't. We also had a really dry year last year, and I kind of started prioritizing what I was watering, and some of the things I didn't water and some of the things I did. So what I have here is an end of the bed where I did put a little bit of some raised garden bed mix on top of my just soil that was here, because in the corners it was kind of sinking down a little bit. Just over time things settle. Usually my beds I top off just with compost yearly, and then once in a while if they seem to settle a lot, I'll add some just good raised bed mix. And you want to make sure it's organic because your food is going. So then again, I am just going to do the same garden tone that we did before. This to me, I already did it most places in here, but this is just a great way to add in kind of some extra oomph to these beds. So again, obviously the biotone, all that when planting. But what I'm doing is I have this in a section of the garden that I don't rotate. So my asparagus obviously does not get rotated. My rhubarb, these 2 beds in general stay always as they are. The 4 long beds down beyond are my tomatoes, my peppers, all those rotate every year just to ward off any soil-borne diseases. But my herbs, since they're perennial, they stay in this spot year to year. And like I said, most of them usually do really well. And this is a great way that you don't have to replant the following year. Now, ones I do have to replant is dill. Sometimes dill will reseed itself really well. This year, I have no starts of dill coming up, so I'm just gonna plant a couple. I use a lot of fresh dill all season long. It's one of my favorite herbs, actually. So I'm gonna plant a couple of those and then a couple of these thyme. Now the thyme, like I said, should live year after year, but sometimes it doesn't. So I have here, I'm just breaking up that root a little bit because these are kind of tight down in there, but otherwise it's just the same. So you can see I have fresh, beautiful soil. That's really easy to work with. I'm gonna make sure to get a little bit of my biotone starter. Again, it's just a nice root stimulator. It really does make a little bit of a difference to put some down in that hole. Put your nice plant right in there, and now this will be happy. Years in the past, I had big, massive herb gardens, but what I found over time was just a few select herbs that I use a lot are what's important to me, and it's more important to me to have the rest of the room for other things like the shallots, like the garlic that I have here, a lot of garlic. And I prioritized and didn't just plant lots of herbs that I don't use, because that ended up not being useful for me. So I'm gonna finish planting these all and then we'll wrap up. So within a few seconds, all that is planted, and you can see it's super easy. But what the point of this all was to show was there's all types and all ways to garden. Herb gardening to vegetable gardening, it can be done in both containers, it can be done in the ground, it can be done in raised beds. All of it has the same principles, and the only thing that changes is possibly the types of soil you use. When you're working with containers, you definitely want to work with all-purpose potting soil. When you're working in raised beds, a good raised bed mix or making your own mix is going to be important for good drainage, aeration, making sure the roots can get through and have some nutrients. And then obviously in the ground, you're gonna have your topsoil, and you may just want to amend it with some good compost over time, or something like garden tone every so often. So all these things work the same, and they can work for a small patio, for a door stoop even, just put 1 or 2 containers, or for a large garden. And it can give us food, it can give us product, it can give us the things we buy at the grocery store, and that's what's exciting about it. You know, I think so often we think of gardening as so much work. We think of the gardens our grandmas had or our moms had, thinking how often they toiled in them. And honestly, gardening can be done on any scale, and it doesn't have to be a lot of work. So enjoy gardening, get excited about gardening, and take these same principles and tricks and tips and hopefully apply them to yourself. That's what I hope this is all about, and I hope it gets you excited, because gardening can be exciting. It can work for everyone. So as always, share these videos around. It helps me immensely. Check my website out, wyseguide.com, to see all the recipes that I make where I use all the things that I grow. I can them, I preserve them, I bake with them, I cook with them. I love to use everything I grow. That's the point of it. So happy gardening. I have to go now water this stuff. That's the exciting part.